Okay, at this point all movement parts have been covered. For the purpose of the PathForger Craft Balance model proposal for Robocraft, today's topic shall be more varied. Today I shall be covering chassis parts, including shielding, and shall also be delving into other core mechanics that may or may not be possible for FreeJam to consider modifying. This is a last-minute consideration, and I'm only now reaching out to yourselves, the player base and Robocraft community, so that you may share your thoughts and discussion on these matters. The aim, as always, is that a more transparent and healthy situation may arise, where gatekeepers are not permitted to be in a position to strangle said, community's feedback. If I receive sufficient feedback, then I will cover such as its own separate entity at a later point in time, even if that should nudge these parts down different paths from those envisioned by myself. These discussions remain open. I shall be linking these and shall also at some point be linking a further community post where I outline the directions that I'd like to take chassis parts towards, as well as several adjustable mechanics. With that out of the way, let us go over chassis parts. First, one finds the block-type chassis parts, and these come in 5 varieties: mediums, lights, heavies, compacts. Also heliums, but I'll speak of that a little later. These are block types that come in various shapes from which the body of a bot is constructed. Their primary purpose is to provide health and connectivity to the essential functional elements of a bot. All block shapes have the same health and the same weight, well, within their particular category. Where they differ is hitbox and number of connections, a cube having as many as 6, while a corner having as few as 3. As their name suggests, lights, mediums, and heavies have different weight levels. They each cost 1 CPU, and so they rely on weight to balance them in terms of value per cost. This works for lights and mediums, but not so much for heavies. Heavies are actually rather light for heavies and could more fairly be termed medium heavies. Compact blocks are so named because they cost 3 times the CPU as other blocks, and so one can generally actually expect to end up with a more compact bot build as a result of using them heavily. Helium blocks are a block that exerts a constant lift force upon builds to the tune of some 145 or so kilos, and this is what they should be about: lift. Unfortunately, individuals with no regard to the balance of the game decided to make them so tanky that they presently put heavies and compacts to shame, which is why they are often used to augment heavy builds' health rather than do what helium actually does: lift. As a lifting block, helium also suffers from an unspecified but significant degree of drag. That covers regular shaped blocks. Next up we have rods and struts, which can be considered macro chassis parts. To begin with rods, these are light and reasonably tough, thinner sections of chassis that span several spaces. The value of a rod is that it can serve to span gaps and help to hold builds together. A further benefit specific to rods is that one can actually wrap certain types of shapes of other chassis blocks around their narrower sections for a resultant added density of health, and even the potential unintended bonus of cancelling out the shared hitbox space when either rod or blocks get taken out. Struts are similar to rods, except that they are thicker, tougher variants, as heavy as medium blocks on the whole. They do not benefit from block wrapping, but they do offer more coverage in and of themselves and also have more health overall. That covers macro chassis parts. Last but not least, on the chassis parts list we have electroplates. Now technically, shields belong in their own section alongside modules, but let's be honest with ourselves, electroplates are just expensive parts of some coverage with a high pool of health. In Robocraft, one finds that most of these have just the one connection point, which has tended to be a limiting factor with them, as mono connection parts are notoriously vulnerable to getting critted off a build, the mounting block or part being destroyed. Most of them also offer a degree of coverage, and due to their higher healths, tend to serve as their own damage sinks. There are 2 exceptions in Tier 5 that both enjoy 6 connection points instead of just the 1, and which both offer a wide area of coverage. And before I should forget, all electroplates are light, about as light as rods on a weight per CPU basis. This rounds off all the chassis parts in Robocraft. There do exist a few other block types: glass blocks, neon blocks, cardboard blocks, and classic blocks. But all of these are just cosmetic variants of medium blocks, and are functionally the same. There technically also exists a cosmetic variant of the long rod called Fairy Light, which is the only cosmetic part to enjoy 2 connection points and theoretically enjoys the benefits of a long rod but with no health and a worse hitbox. Those are the parts as presently exist. Whether it be blocks or macro blocks or electroplates, all of these, with the slight exception of heliums, serve the same purpose: to provide structural integrity to bot builds. Back to Digo Booster's master sheet of Robocraft part stats. As usual, I've linked Digo Booster's sheet in the description, as it is still a useful source of information about the full set of Robocraft parts. Now, chassis parts are generally a simple enough topic that I've pretty much already covered their purpose, and so I shall delve straight into the proposals for the PathForger Craft balance model for Robocraft for as far as these are concerned. Before getting into such, it is to be noted that any asks of FreeJam concerning adjustments, even in territory as simple as this, should be made with one's reasons soundly laid out, and transparently so, as while they may be simple, chassis parts make up the actual building blocks for bots in the game. And of course, this is the part of the video where I get to ask you what you think about these various chassis parts. What is the role that a light, medium, heavy or compact block should have in the game? How about heliums, rods, struts, electroplates? Where do all these fit in? As always, it helps to think in terms of both the bigger picture as well as that which benefits the part concerned. When this video continues, I will share my thoughts. Do feel free to pause the video should you like to think about the balance of these chassis parts without my influence. Have you given this any thought? Continuing in 3, 2, 1. I have mentioned my preference to clone parts in an effort to bring a greater diversity to the game. With regards to chassis parts, I will leave my thoughts on this towards a little further on. So let's talk chassis blocks. Mediums stay the same. 2000 health is a nice round number for a block, and having it attributed to an average block sounds fine to me. 10 kilos per block is also a good standard weight. Of course, weight cannot be adjusted, but I've also taken this into consideration while thinking about ideal mass weights. Heavy blocks take a cut in health to be 500 more health than mediums, which is especially fine considering that they are better called medium heavies at their present weight. But I would also like them to be reinstated to the 100 kilos per block point at some point in the future, if that ever becomes a possibility. A heavy block is only a problem if the balance of the game embraces crippling entire swathes of bot types, as a number of balance changes by the balance server has done. Light blocks also take a cut, bringing them back to being 500 health less than medium blocks. In an ideal world, their mass is also modestly increased to 1 kilo per block, and so one would reinstate the 10 times mass relationship between each weight class of block. As regards compact blocks, I would like to bring them down a single tier. It seems unjustifiable to retain them in 5th tier, as their stats do not quite add up. To facilitate this transition, compact block weights are very slightly increased to 5 kilos each. Well, modestly rather than slightly. Heliums. Helium blocks are being restatted to match medium blocks in health. It was initially my intention to match light blocks, but here's my reasoning. Yes, heliums do provide lift, yes they should be about lift. There's no reason for them to have structural integrity, but they also exert somewhat excessive drag, which is kind of a drag as you can imagine, and it's mostly a problem for faster rather than slower builds. As an aside, that is one reason why Rexhag Bro of the Balance server shoved through so obscene an increase in health to heliums that heliums became a go-to augmentation on mechs of all builds, exceeding all other chassis block types in health. This in spite of heavy opposition from the actual community that he pretends to represent. Well, anyway, my reasoning for doubling CPU and lift is that unless drag is linked to lift, then this should result in helium blocks, which are twice as efficient in what it's actually supposed to be doing, lifting. But in the absence of confirmation that that is even a possibility, just reining in helium's health to the same level as medium blocks will be a massive start. And speaking of mediums, I would conditionally actually like their tier to be increased to tier 2. Now, before you bristle at the notion, I should let you know that this has to do with the earlier mentioned prospect of cloning parts, and the part that I would like to clone would in fact be the medium block. And what would I like to do with this clone? Well, I would like to give it the same health per CPU as light blocks, and the same mass per block as mediums. And I would also like to make them cost half as much as other blocks, so effectively being half a CPU. Now, it is to be noted that the game actually does not support decimal CPUs, but that isn't the only way to make the effective CPU for a part cost less. And in this regards, welcome to a bonus proposal, among several, stored within this video. Scaling up all CPU costs and ceilings by 10. This would mean that the CPU build limit for megabots, for instance, would increase from 10,000 to 100,000 CPU. Don't panic, FreeJam, I'm not about to bust your server, although I do understand that this is more than a big ask nonetheless. For you see, just as the ceilings are increasing by 10, so too are CPU costs increasing by 10. That 100 CPU tier 5 wheel would cost 1000 CPU under the new system. Now, you may be asking, PathForger, but why on earth would you be asking FreeJam to consider scaling up all the CPU ceilings and limits? Do you not know the scale of task that you are suggesting? And my answer to this is, sort of. Sort of-ish? Yes-ish? In order to make this happen, FreeJam wouldn't just have to add a 0 to all part costs. Not only would FreeJam need to add a 0 to both the lower and upper limits for megabots in the game. Not only would FreeJam need to, if CPU is presently a consideration, add zeros to the matchmaker CPU levels for weighting, but FreeJam would also need to add zeros to the Bay upgrade levels, and perhaps even adjustments to the community robot factory. You know what? I wouldn't in the least blame FreeJam for deeming this particular proposal to be a colossal ask of them, and so I frankly wouldn't in any shape or form mind if on this point alone they've outright dismissed the aspect of the proposal outright and, just told me to sod off. Moving on. But succeeding in doing this would allow for a new block to come into existence at a CPU level that would have needed to be a decimal in the older CPU system, and it would also allow mediums to exist in tier 2, restoring the lights, mediums and heavies dichotomy in the same tier, and for balance purposes that is technically a good thing. Furthermore, it would allow future CPU-based balancing of the parts in the game to occur at a much finer granularity than is presently possible. And furthermore, this block, this basic block, this damned block, upon which this entire proposal, or this section of the proposal is based, is intended to promote art builds. Because guess what? If you're spending less CPU on adding nice stuff to your build, nice geometry, artbot designs can become crazier, and even so-called competitive designs can look nicer at the very least, for cheaper. It's less of a compromise. But yes, that would be a lot of work for those levels of games. Undoubtedly a great effort for a smaller benefit, depending on your perspective. Let's just consider this aspect a nice to have, which is unlikely to happen, but I wanted to mention it anyway. Okay, that was a roller coaster, and we've just covered block-based chassis parts in this section. But while on the subject of CPU levels, I suppose a couple more diversions could not hurt too much. Firstly, I would like to point out that the current system of requiring beginner players to upgrade their bays up from 750 CPU places these new players at a real innate disadvantage that isn't really very reasonable. Even though these players, to be fair, can quickly gain in ranks at the beginning and quickly build up at least the one bay to, 1500 or so CPU without too much trouble, it's still a disadvantage. And there really are only two ways to go about remedying this. One option, and I can't believe I'm actually saying this, is to bring back damage boost in some capacity. And I'm fairly sure that, like health boost, damage boost has simply been set to a 0 value. Although I sometimes could swear that a semblance of damage boost still persists among tier 1 bots. I could be mistaken, I've never proven it to be the case, but it seems like it's the case. I'm not sure. Now, I absolutely despise damage boost, and the reason for this is simple. Unlike health and speed boost in the past, the way that one got damage boost wasn't through building, but rather it was through the choice of not building. Feeling too lazy to build a 2000 CPU bot and stitch together a rail with some legs? Let's slap a big old damage boost onto that, just to make sure that, pristine gun on legs can compete with that thing that took 2 hours to build. The results didn't feel good, and it was the direct opposite of making building matter. However, we are at a juncture where it may be preferable for sub-2000 CPU bots to enjoy an artificial plus in firepower, just so as to give beginner players in their 750 to 1000 CPU tier 1 bots faced against 2000 CPU tier 2 bots something akin to a prayer in those dire straits. Of course, a much milder maximum damage boost would be in order. I'm thinking 30%, so that a 1000 CPU bot can enjoy a 15% damage buff, which would be handy when new players are facing players with fully upgraded weapons. However, that was the more desperate option, in my opinion. A simpler solution is for beginner players to be granted a single bay at 2000 max CPU from the outset. You create your account, you have at least one bay, which is maxed out at 2000 CPU. True, this would mean that new players could very quickly break into higher tiers just after a few matches, and with some choice tech tree unlocks. However, let's be honest with ourselves here. The action primarily exists from tiers 3 and up, and the longer one keeps new players in the lower tiers, the greater odds that boredom will hit and they'll try out Robocraft 2, or, not yet being invested, some other game. Since my rambling has strayed upon tiers as a territory, perhaps this is a good time to let that onto here also, as I would like to see some changes here also. It should firstly come as no surprise that presuming damage boost isn't going to become a thing again, and I kind of hope not, I would like it to be physically possible for new players to run a 2000 CPU bot in tier 1. For as long as it remains possible for a tier 1 bot and a tier 2 bot to meet, I'd rather that the new player not have bot CPU working against them amongst all other things. With the doubling of tier 1 CPU, Tiers 2 and 3 also get an upward bump. This may provide an opening to matchmaking exploiters, especially in Tier 3, but I've endeavored to keep the gap between Tiers 3 and 4 wide. I must admit that here too I feel compelled to nod to the balance server, as they did decimate Tier 3's desirability for both matchmaking exploiters and randoms alike when they downward adjusted it. So yes, that was chassis parts and the rabbit hole that led to. This brings us to rods and struts. To rods, I would like to leave them more or less around the same level of health as present, somewhere between mediums and lights in health, with the difference that the dual connection parts have a little more health than the quad connection parts. I would personally prefer to make macro parts with more connections heavier rather than more fragile, but mass as per usual cannot really be touched, at least not at the moment. With regards to struts, I would like to rein them in similarly to heavy blocks. These are parts that practically weigh the same as medium blocks. Their health values are overtuned, and I would like to see them occupy a space between mediums and heavies for health level, while also narrowing the gap between dual and quad connection struts that currently exists. In fairness here, I will grant the balance server a further nod of acknowledgement, as they were on the right track when they introduced this. With macro chassis parts out of the way, now we come to electroplates. Mono connection electroplates have been inflated in health for quite some time, and with no regard to the tier level of the part. In this regards, I seek to introduce different tier health per CPU values, and this brings them to health levels equal to or greater than that of medium blocks. Before moving on, I would also like to reduce the cost of the smallest Electroshield A, by 2 CPU to bring them down to 20 CPU. This brings it in line with the CPU scaling for all other plates in those tiers, and this reduces the crit inefficiency of running these shields, which quite frankly have no coverage going for them to begin with. So why not? At the same time, multi-connection electroplates have been pushed into an awkward corner of providing so little health per CPU that players have increasingly been finding it preferable to spend their CPU on movement parts such as Tier 5 hovers. As such, I would like to upward adjust the health levels of these two multi-connection plates to exist between light and medium blocks in health, and conveniently at the exact same health level as the proposed Tier 5 hover's health. So that covers the proposed changes for chassis parts as well as a few bonus components, namely the upscaling of all CPU costs and limits by 10, sorry free jam, introducing a new basic block which can be used for art block purposes, adjusting the robo-ranking ceilings for tiers, and making the game more beginner friendly. A more diverse lineup of topics than the norm, but the chassis parts monologue kind of branched out, what can I say? So that's all from me, and now over to you, the viewer. Today's topics were again varied, so what are your thoughts on the various kinds of chassis parts? Is there any such part that you feel strongly about? How would all CPU costs and ceilings being multiplied by 10 impact you? What are your thoughts concerning the proposals for new players? Do you remember Damage Boost? If so, what was it to you? Was it a fond memory or a bad one? Would you like to see it return? What impacts, if any, do you expect to see from each or all of these changes? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and I will meet you there. And of course, thank you for watching.